Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the world of risk.
Yep, risk. It's everywhere, right?
It is. And, we got some interesting research from our listeners on two terms that get tossed around a lot, risk appetite and risk tolerance.
Yeah, you hear those two terms used almost interchangeably.
Exactly. But in our deep dive today, we're going to see why understanding the nuances, the difference, is actually critical for making smart decisions.
Absolutely, and I think what's really interesting here is that these concepts provide a framework, a way of understanding how organizations and individuals really approach risk.
So it's not just about being a risk taker or risk averse.
Right, it's not just black and white, it's more about having a system to analyze, to manage risk effectively.
A system. Okay, so let's start breaking this down. And I think the best place to start is with risk appetite.
Perfect.
So our sources define risk appetite as essentially an organization's overall willingness to accept risk
Yeah, to accept risk in pursuit of its objectives.
in pursuit of its objectives.
Right. So think of it this way. A company's risk appetite, it's almost like a statement about its culture, its goals.
So take a venture capital firm, for example.
Perfect example. By its very nature, it's going to have a very high risk appetite.
They're looking for those big wins, even if it means that there's a higher chance of failure on the way.
Exactly. They're playing a different game than, say, a company that manages retirement funds,
Totally.
where stability is paramount. Capital preservation, that's their priority.
So a totally different risk appetite.
Much lower. They're not chasing those high growth, high risk opportunities.
So risk appetite sets the stage. It's the big picture, right?
It is. It is. It's the first step. But then we get to risk tolerance, and that's where I think things get a little bit more
More specific.
precisely. Risk tolerance is about boundaries. Setting those boundaries for different types of risk.
Different types. So we're talking financial risk, operational risk.
Reputational risks.
Okay.
A whole spectrum.
Okay. So it's about saying, okay, we have a high risk appetite overall, but we need to set some limits.
Yeah. Limits on, for example, how much we're willing to lose on any single investment.
It's interesting because one of the sources that we're looking at brought up a case study, and this was with a pharmaceutical company.
Oh, interesting.
And they had a high risk appetite for developing new drugs, which makes sense. But they set a very low risk tolerance for patient safety during clinical trials.
That's a perfect illustration. They understood that innovation inherently requires taking risks. But at the same time, certain areas like patient safety
Have to be approached more cautiously.
Exactly.
And that's where you see the potential for conflict if these two things aren't aligned.
Oh, absolutely. A company could miss out on groundbreaking discoveries if their risk tolerance is too stringent. Or even worse.
Yeah.
They could face serious consequences, ethically, legally, if it's too lax.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, that balance.
The sweet spot where risk appetite and risk tolerance are working together in harmony, that's what leads to good decisions, smart decisions, and ultimately success.
And that's what we all want. So it's this balance, this harmony that is just so crucial. And one of the reports you shared actually goes deeper into why defining both risk appetite and risk tolerance is so important.
It is. It really is. There are a few key reasons, and they all sort of build on each other.
Okay, well, the first one that I noticed that jumped out at me was strategic alignment.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. And I think essentially what that means is making sure that every decision reflects the organization's overall goals and comfort level with risk.
So it's like having that company-wide understanding of, okay, this is the level of risk that we're willing to take on.
Right. So you don't have different departments, different teams, operating in silos.
Taking actions that contradict the larger plan.
Right. So let's say, hypothetically, you have a company that has a high risk appetite for innovation in their product development, right?
Okay, so new products, they're willing to take some risks.
But a very low tolerance for financial risk. They don't want to go bankrupt.
Right, makes sense.
So the R&D team, they might be encouraged to push the boundaries, explore those cutting edge ideas.
But at the same time,
Finance, they have to make sure that none of those explorations put the company's financial stability in jeopardy.
so checks and balances, essentially.
Checks and balances, exactly.
Making sure that one team isn't, running off the cliff.
Exactly. And that actually leads us to the second point that this report really emphasizes.
Okay.
Consistency. Having those clear definitions for both appetite and tolerance helps prevent that.
Prevent like those wildly different approaches across an organization.
Right. Everyone's playing by the same rules. Everybody understands the big picture and how their actions contribute to it.
So consistency, everyone's on the same page.
On the same page, yeah.
That makes sense.
It's like sheet music. Everyone has their part to play.
This next one is interesting, though, because it's stakeholder confidence.
Yeah.
So how do these tie into that?
Oh, that's a huge one, especially in today's environment, right? You think about it, investors, regulators, employees, even the public,
Yeah.
they want to know that organizations are managing risk responsibly.
So it's about transparency.
It's about transparency. It's about accountability. You're demonstrating that, risk isn't something to be feared.
Right. It's carefully considered.
It's managed. There's a plan.
There's a plan in place.
There's a plan.
One of the articles you sent mentioned a study. And this study found that there was a strong correlation between a company's clearly defined risk management framework
Okay. Yeah.
and its stock price performance.
It makes sense, right? It's not just good practice. It actually can impact the bottom line.
Investors are more likely to invest in a company that is transparent about risk.
Yeah, especially in a volatile market.
Okay, so we've established why defining risk appetite and tolerance is so important.
Yeah, it's foundational.
Hmm.
But how do we actually do it? How do organizations actually put these into practice? It can't just be as easy as saying, we're okay with this much risk.
Right.
We're comfortable with this.
Right, there's got to be a process, right?
There's got to be a process.
And thankfully, one of the white papers we looked at outlines a framework, a 4-step framework, and it's pretty clear-cut.
Okay, I like clear cut. Let's hear it. Step 1, and this seems obvious, is start with your goals.
Yeah. Figure out what you're trying to achieve.
But how do organizational goals tie into risk?
Well, and this is where I think a lot of companies kind of trip up because they jump into defining their risk appetite before they even clarify what they're trying to do, what they're trying to achieve. Your goals shape your risk appetite, right? A young tech company aiming for explosive growth, they're going to have a much different risk appetite than, say, a utility company focused on just providing a reliable service to its customers. That's a great point. So before you even start talking about how much risk are we willing to take, you need to figure out where you're trying to go. Risk, it's a tool, It's not just something to avoid.
A tool. I love that.
It can help you get to where you want to go.
Absolutely.
So once you've defined your goals,
Yeah.
step 2, categorize your risks.
Yeah, you got to identify and categorize the risks you're facing. This means breaking down risk into those specific types.
So we're talking financial risk,
Operational.
reputational risk, compliance risk.
Yeah.
Get granular, get specific.
So instead of having this kind of vague idea about risk in general, you're really getting down into the weeds.
Down in the weeds, yeah.
Okay, so you've identified your goals, you've categorized your risks. Step 3, this is where things start to get a little more, technical, right?
Yeah, data and metrics. This is where the rubber meets the road. You're taking those risk categories and setting specific, measurable tolerance thresholds for each one.
For each one. So for example, let's say you're concerned about financial risk. You might set a maximum percentage of revenue that you're willing to lose on any investment.
Okay, so you're putting some boundaries around it.
Boundaries.
Yeah.
Or if you're worried about reputational risk, you might develop a system for quantifying that damage to your brand based on certain actions.
I'm seeing how this framework kind of builds. You start with that big picture,
Yeah.
your goals, your overall appetite,
Right.
and then you break it down into smaller, more manageable pieces.
Exactly. And remember, these thresholds, they're not set in stone.
Oh, okay.
They need to be reviewed and adjusted.
Adjusted based on...
The market,
Mhm.
regulations, the whole landscape, even internal priorities,
Makes sense. Although this does all make a lot of sense, but I think there's a potential pitfall here, right? If you're not careful, this can all become very complex,
Overly complex.
bureaucratic, right? You could end up with this risk management framework that's so rigid, so convoluted, it's actually hindering progress.
That's a great point, and I think that highlights the importance of step 4.
Okay.
Engaging leadership and stakeholders, and throughout this whole process.
So you need buy-in, right?
Buy-in, for sure. It's not enough to just have this amazing, brilliant framework just sitting there on paper.
It has to be usable.
It has to be usable. It has to be alive.
So how do we get there?
Well, this is where leadership really, really comes in. They need to champion this. They need to communicate it. And they need to create a culture where people feel comfortable.
Comfortable doing what?
Talking about risk, raising concerns.
It can't just be top-down, though, right?
Oh, absolutely not. You've got to engage stakeholders at every level.
I was thinking about that because it's the frontline employees.
Yeah, yeah.
They're the ones that are often closest to the action, right?
Yeah.
They're seeing those risks emerge.
They're in the trenches. Their
Yeah.
input is so valuable.
And that's why it's so important to have a system where people feel safe,
Safe to speak up.
even if it means, challenging the status quo.
Challenging the status quo, flagging a potential problem, something that someone else might have missed.
And this all seems really relevant, even for someone who's not, a CEO or a chief risk officer.
It is.
I'm thinking about our listener. Maybe they're just starting their career,
Hmm.
or maybe they're just thinking about making a big change.
A big life change.
So how do these concepts apply on a personal level?
Hmm.
Risk appetite and tolerance.
I love that you're bringing this back to the individual because it's so important, right? If you think about your career aspirations, those are your goals. Your risk appetite, that might dictate whether you're drawn to more stable, predictable roles
It's a 9 to 5.
or if you're more inclined to pursue something entrepreneurial.
Something with a bit more uncertainty.
Higher risk, higher reward. So someone with a higher risk appetite might be more comfortable jumping into a startup,
Knowing it could fail.
knowing it could fail, but also recognizing that huge potential for growth and learning.
So someone with a lower risk appetite might prioritize, job security, steady income.
Yeah. Over that potential for, rapid advancement or those high stakes decisions. It's all about knowing yourself.
And then risk tolerance.
Mm.
It comes into play when you're actually making decisions within that broader context.
Right. So if you're that person in the startup, your risk tolerance, that might dictate how much of your own money are you putting in
How many hours you're willing to work without that steady paycheck.
without a guarantee. It's all about boundaries. Setting boundaries even within a high risk environment.
So you're not exposing yourself to more than you can handle.
Exactly. It's about sustainability in a way.
It's so fascinating how these concepts, we think about them in the corporate world,
Big business.
but they really can be applied to our own personal lives,
Yeah.
our own decisions.
Our own journeys. It's a good reminder that risk isn't just about numbers.
Right?
It's a part of life.
It is.
It's part of the human experience.
And becoming aware of our own risk appetite, our own tolerance, can help us make better choices.
For sure. We can navigate uncertainty better and ultimately achieve greater success, however we define that.
Okay, so to kind of recap everything we've talked about in this deep dive, risk appetite, risk tolerance, these are two distinct but very much connected concepts.
Yeah. Interwoven. They give us this framework for making those strategic decisions. Risk appetite is that big picture, your willingness to embrace uncertainty. And risk tolerance is more about, okay, where do we set those limits for specific risks?
And when you define both of them clearly,
Yeah.
you align them with your goals,
And you get everybody involved.
all those stakeholders, you can create a system for managing risk.
Mm.
And that not only minimizes those potential downsides, but also opens up so many opportunities, whether you're leading a company, a team, or just navigating your own personal life.
We've covered a lot today. But I think if there's one thing that I really hope our listeners take away from this deep dive, it's that risk is not the enemy.
Yeah, it gets a bad rap. It does. It's a force to be understood, to be respected even.
You can harness it.
By embracing it, we can unlock our full potential.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.